Welcome to another edition of the Mixed Martial Arts Beat. I'm Ariel Helwani. Well, we've got a huge show lined up for all of you. We appreciate all the support for the first two episodes. Very much looking forward to episode number 3. We have one familiar face, 2 new faces. Let's get right into it. Joining us today in our New York City SB Nation studios, our good friend of ESPN.com, ESPN the magazine, Chuck Mindenhall.
Yep.
Not Mindenhall.
Not Mindenhall.
Called you Mindenhall a few times on my show. It's Mindenhall. I want to apologize publicly for all the people. Now we've got the returning Luke Thomas of MMAfighting.com and Spike TV's MMA Uncensored, who just got married. Mazel tov. Wow, and you got the ring too.
I did, yeah, I did. It was a rewarding experience. Hopefully I never have to do that again.
Very well said. And also joining us, so happy to be joined by the leather jacket wearing Matthew Pauly, the New York Times best-selling author. We've never had one of those in this studio. He is the author of Tapped Out, which comes out in paperback on October 2nd. Also the author of American Shaolin. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll talk about the book in a bit.
Great.
All right, guys. So obviously, this was supposed to be one of the busiest weekends of the year in mixed martial arts. We were going to have Season 7 of Bellator debuting on MTV2 on Friday, UFC on Fuel TV number 5 on Saturday afternoon from jolly old England, and then Strikeforce, Melendez versus Bam Bam Healy on Saturday night. Unfortunately, Strikeforce was canceled. Luke, let's start with you. What do you make of the decision on Showtime's end, let's start with them, to not air this card once it was announced that Gilbert Melendez was not healthy enough to fight?
I think it's pretty telling, right? So let's go back to April of 2011. Showtime bantamweight tourney in boxing. You've got Johnny Perez, Abner Mares, Joseph Agbeko, and you've got Vic Darchinyan. The main event between Joseph Agbeko and Abner Mares falls out very late because Agbeko comes down with sciatica. Showtime decided to air one consolation bout. It wasn't even the semifinal or the co-main, or it was a co-main, but it wasn't for anything other than third place, Vic Darchinyan and Johnny Perez. The fight doesn't even go 6 rounds. It gets stopped in the 5th. They still went forward with that. Now, that was under a different tenure. That was Ken Hirschman. Right. Okay, fair enough. But to me, it is rather telling that at least in the sort of tenure of of Showtime leadership, they thought a one-fight card for nothing was more important than airing a Strikeforce event that had lost its main event. Listen, not to disrespect the rest of the guys on that card, but I absolutely think that that decision was correct to not air it. And more importantly, I mean, we sound like broken records, but I don't know how many different times we have to say it, how many different ways we have to say it. The cards are too thin. If I could say another language to be more effective, I would. That is my point. My point is that it is incredibly telling that a one-fight boxing card made it to Showtime, and the rest of the card for Strikeforce's event did not.
And we were talking about Strikeforce, who only holds 6 or so events a year. I think what is most interesting about this decision, Chuck, is that, let's be honest, I mean, you look at the ratings and their history on Showtime. Gilbert Melendez, while most of us in the know, in the MMA hardcore space, consider him maybe a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter, he's not a huge draw. He's not a massive draw. You put anything online about him, he's just a hardcore fans type of fighter. Did they not see the rest of the card before agreeing to this? I find it a little interesting that they would just scrap the whole event just because Gilbert's not able to fight.
I'm sort of torn on that because you look, Gilbert Melendez, he's had plenty of fights with Strikeforce. We know his name. Obviously, you're mentioning he's a top guy, but the co-main event of this fight, nobody's going to know who those guys are. John Vellante, some people are going to know who that guy is, but nobody's going to know who Guto and Asante is. And so how do you sell that fight? How do you even talk about that fight? Nobody was even paying attention to that fight, and very few people were even paying attention to Gilbert Melendez's fight with Pat Healy. A lot of people thought that was just sort of cobbled together. This one's going to slide under the radar. The whole thing, I agree with Luke. I just think that, you know, ultimately, when that top fight, your one main guy falls out, what are you going to do other than, you know, scrap the card, not televise it, and then scrap the card.
And then Strikeforce scraps the card. Matthew, what do you think of this? I mean, obviously, we've talked a lot about the decision, you know, between, or I should say the relationship between Zuffa, Forza LLC, which is under Zuffa, which owns Strikeforce, and Showtime, and how it's a little awkward, right? I almost applaud, even though I don't really agree with the decision to not air the card, I almost applaud Showtime because it feels like for the first time since Zuffa bought Strikeforce last March, that they're saying enough is enough. You know, you bought the company, you took away some of our biggest stars, Nick Diaz, Alistair Overeem, you took those guys away, you're taking away the heavyweight division. We're not gonna sit here and allow you to give us a lesser product. Did you view it that way?
Yeah, I think there's an aspect to it that reminds me when I was talking to some mid-level Zuffa employees last year. They were talking about who got the Strikeforce job, and it was basically sort of not it. It was kind of like latrine duty, like who was stuck doing Strikeforce, and so their relationship to Strikeforce itself is limited. And then, of course, Showtime's stuck here with an inferior product. I mean, one of the things I was just looking up because I was talking to Ryan Couture, and he was saying how there's so few people to fight on the Strikeforce card is Strikeforce has 82 fighters on its roster. Bellator has 122, and the UFC has 347.
Right.
So they basically slowly gutting the company, and at a certain point it becomes, as Ben Folks mentioned, a bad divorce, right? You start seeing like free the kids because both people don't want to be in this relationship. And so that to me is what this struck me as Melendez didn't seem to want to fight that bad. I mean, he said in his earlier days he'd have gone with a broken leg, and here he's saying, I need to think about the business career decision.
Right.
And Showtime was like, well, we didn't really want to put the show on in the first place, so any excuse to get out of it. So it seems to me like this is one of those relationships that's breaking down, and now we're seeing whoever wants to get out of it have an excuse, and suddenly things break down.
Should be known real quickly, like, the years of investment in mixed martial arts by Showtime, they've got a decent subscriber base of people who will tune in. It is, to me, rather striking. They said, we're not going to feed them any old thing. We're only going to give them something we feel is up to par, even if it's only a main event and the rest of the card is not that great, but we're going to give them the stars we have, or we're going to give them nothing. I kind of think that's a good way to go about it. Either you give them great product, or you wait until a great product comes back around.
And obviously, the times have changed. The deal is different. But this card, sans Gilbert Melendez, is it that much worse than your old Strikeforce Challengers card or Show XC card?
It goes there on Friday nights, not Saturday nights.
Sure, but okay, so they're putting, I believe it's a Marathon of Homeland.
They just won a bunch of Emmys.
Oh, okay. So you do think that's better. Is that what you're trying to say, Homeland? Marathon.
Emmy-winning award.
Yeah.
The only fight on that main card outside the main event, I mean, they had Volante versus Innocence, was Fodor versus Josh Thompson.
Right.
That's an okay fight, but, you know, listen, in all due respect, George Gurgel versus Mizuto Hirata, like, I mean, that was on extreme.
But yeah, George Santiago
someone would have had to move up. So it probably would have been that one or another
True.
one. I just mean, it wasn't there.
But why did Showtime agree to the card in the first place? Only one guy dropped off.
Right.
Why did they agree to it in the first place if they didn't like it?
Because they agreed to him. Well, they don't build from Guto Innocence up. They build from Melendez down. And I think Melendez, and I think it should be noted, like when you put up a Gilbert Melendez article, it doesn't blow up online. I mean, he has a dedicated base, and he is obviously extraordinarily talented. But yeah, I mean, they need the few guys they have, the Rouseys, the Melendezes, the Rockholds. Either they're going to feature them or they're not, and that's the way the world's going to work.
After the cancellation of UFC 151, and it is important to note that Zuffa has always said that was their main thing, especially Dana White. We don't cancel cards, right? This year they've canceled two, less than 2 weeks out. And if you look at the Montreal card that was supposed to take place in March, which they essentially postponed to November, and there was supposed to be an FX card in Indy in September, which they changed because they said a schedule. It's 4 cards this year that have had to change for various reasons. But after UFC 151 was canceled, everyone wanted to say, who's to blame? Who should we point the finger at? Well, who's to blame in this one? Because Gilbert, okay, he was injured, he didn't cancel the card. Who is to blame here? Is, Zuffa, when they find out that Showtime isn't going to air the card, and it should be noted that they are going to pay the fighters, and that's commendable. But should Zuffa have just put this on so that the fans who bought the tickets and the fight, they get a fight, or do you think it was the right call to at the end of the day?
It's hard to say. I don't know what the ticket sales on that were up in Sacramento. Some of the live gates that we've been seeing from Strikeforce have been very small.
Very bad.
But at the same time, I think once again you're going to have to distribute the blame. I just think it's one of those those things that comes together, and when it falls apart, when it does fall apart. I don't know if you can look at Zuffa for pulling the plug on it. If the product is going to be like you were saying with Showtime, the product's not going to be where they want it. If it's not going to be a good Strikeforce card, if it's not going to be that, just take it off. I don't know who's to blame with this. What's more interesting to me is how much we're talking about it right now, but I have not heard a lot of people actually bringing this up, and I think part of it is because there is a UFC happening on the same night, and part of it is that Strikeforce is just at this hobbled stage, and it's existence where I don't think too many people think it's going to survive any longer. So people don't care. I don't know how much they care even when the whole card is intact, because the guys, we don't know who's going where, who's doing what. If it's the last time we'll see Melendez and Strikeforce, who's going to challenge him next. It's like the Yates thing. being tied to a dying animal. You know, he's talking about being old and his mind being active, though still active. It's like that. You have vital pieces, a few vital pieces, but they're just sort of stranded in this promotion. And it's just such a mess at this point. Like casting blame anywhere, it's just the whole handling of Strikeforce at this point comes into question. And you know, I don't know where you start on that. It's just the Zuffa phasing out. We don't know. It's all speculation still.
You talked about the future. This is what we know, Luke, about the future of Strikeforce. Actually, it should be noted as well that both Zuffa and Showtime doesn't like to talk about their contracts, but we have it on pretty good authority that there's one more option to be had on Showtime's side. They could pick up the option next year around early spring of 2013. Then it's done. Then it's up to Zuffa the following year to decide whether or not. So I think Showtime, correct me if I'm wrong, and or if you disagree, Showtime, I mean, if you look at what else is out there, even this lesser product, you still get Ronda Rousey, you still get the occasional big fight. It's better for them to stick in the Strikeforce business, despite everything that we're saying, all the negativity, than just say, okay, we don't want to work with you guys, pull the plug, and let's go elsewhere and look for a new MMA promotion. Don't you agree?
I do not agree.
Really?
But I don't totally disagree with what your point is, which is the following. They need to stay in the mixed martial arts business, and there's not a lot of good options out there. But, you know, listen, look back on the tenure of the UFC, or Zuffa, I should say. When was the last time they effectively managed two organizations at the same time? Never. They've never done it effectively. They had an early good run with the WEC, with the hallmark being the Faber-Pulver fight that did gangbusters, right? But after that, things just, they're so invested in the UFC, as they should be, things fall to the wayside. I remember the days when they were going to have Pride UFC Super Bowls. Again, things fell apart for different reasons. It just doesn't work. I say get rid of Strikeforce altogether, but why not go into the UFC business? Why not put the cards they have? I know that you know, they're deeply invested in the Fox platform, but this is premium cable too. I think this would open them up a little bit. Why not have fights on that premium cable channel?
They can't do it.
In the,
Fox has the exclusive rights.
Period.
Yeah. This is a CBS property. They're not going to get in that business.
Well, then,
they can't do it.
Okay.
This is a fantasy world you're living in.
This is fantasy world living in. All I'm saying is this is a bridge to nowhere. The current Strikeforce situation is a bridge to nowhere, right? You can keep guys on there, but it is borderline immoral to do what they're doing to guys like Gilbert Melendez, to guys like Luke Rockhold. We talk about their window is going away. And what's happening to it? They are languishing in this field of nothingness. And who is that fair to? Is it fair to Showtime? Great. Is it fair to Zuffa? Great. That's about it. It's about it.
How about this? Bellator is moving to Spike TV.
Yes.
Spike TV owned by Viacom. Showtime's in the Viacom family as well. The major umbrella is CBS, right?
All right.
Is it in their best interest to pull the plug on this, get in the Bellator business,
Yeah.
and now start working with someone who is interested in growing the product? And obviously, Viacom essentially owns the majority of Bellator. You know, does that make more sense? Do you see that happening?
I think that makes more sense, right? Because the problem is, if you're in business with Zuffa, Zuffa doesn't want to be in business with you. The reason Dana bought Strikeforce, at least to my understanding, is to get rid of a competitor. So you want to be, if you're in Showtime, either in business with the UFC or in business with the next competitor. And the next competitor, obviously, is Bellator. They have more fighters. They have more energy behind them. Strikeforce is a dying organization. So I think that would be the way to go, like some sort of deal between Spike and Showtime in the future. I mean, this just looks to me like sort of we're watching a messy divorce, and we don't know when they're going to release everybody from it. And so we're just seeing the first, I mean, it's not the first signs, but this is sort of the biggest breakout of it.
Well, Bellator's season 7 kicked off this week, and it feels to me like a lame duck season to me, because Bellator is about to make their debut on Spike TV. You know, King Mo is going to be saved for that. They've got guys like Bob Blue, and King Mo's not 100% healthy, so it works out. But they're making big moves on Spike January of 2013. It seems like they're not going to put out a big fight. The Alvarez situation's a little different because his contract expires. They need to give him a fight. But they're going to wait. They're going to have this season on MTV2 and then bring out the big guns January 2013. What does Bellator need to do, Chuck, to really make an impact here? And I think it's very interesting that Dana White, obviously he was asked this question at the post-fight press conference. It's the first time, and he said it. He said, I have respect for those guys. I'm not going to bother those guys. I have nothing against them. But he started talking about the contracts. And you have Bjorn responding this week, calling them hypocritical. It seems like the beginning of something bigger between Bellator and the UFC. What does Bellator need to do, though, to really establish themselves as number 2?
Did you say against?
I did.
I heard that as well. Well, the first thing is just for basic production. If you're just talking about aesthetics and starting there, I just still think that the lighting and things like that just need to be fixed. So far, a lot of the Bellator, I remember going back to WC, there was big complaints about the blue cage, everything like that. And it was hard for me to watch those fights and get past that, striking. But if you just start there, better line, better production. And then on the model note, I just want to see their champions fight. I feel like a lot of their champions just kind of sit there idle for long periods of time, or they take cameo fights like Eduardo Dantas just did, and ends up losing. A guy retires, Cole Conrad. I mean, it's just, right now, you want to see those guys fight. I don't know how they want to put it together, if it's always going to be contingent on these guys coming up to fight them, but they need to have fights. They need to figure out how to get those guys fighting more, at least 3 times a year. So that's what I would like to see.
I am not a believer in that tournament model.
Yeah.
I am not a believer in it. And I know they are believers in it, and it's just a matter of opinion. I could be terribly wrong about it. I think that tournament model is the fastest way to kill enthusiasm about a fighter I think I've ever seen.
Why?
When MMA promoters began to have some success, we kept hearing this, not just from Zuffa, but other people too, like, we're going to right all the wrongs that boxing made, and they did. But I think one thing boxing gets right is they really groom guys a long time. In MMA, the biggest stars are really the only guys who kick everyone else's ass. Everyone else is not really a star anymore, and that doesn't need to be the case. Chael Sonnen is an exception, but Chael Sonnen is the exception, right? He was outlining everyone's. There needs to be space in MMA where, where unless you're John Jones or Ronda Rousey, you have a little bit of room to be a fan favorite, to be a guy people care about. And a couple guys here or there have carved out careers like that. That model is the fastest way to kill it. Paul Daly has no business fighting in that tournament because he's not going to win. And even if he wins, Ben Askren is going to, the conventional wisdom is, I love Ben Askren. I love watching him fight. But he's going to beat him in a... I actually really do. Well, I'm a wrestling nerd. So, he's going to beat him in a boring way.
Right. Same with Ben Saunders, guys like that.
Exactly.
It doesn't matter if they get through it. They navigate the field. They have their death sentence at the end of it because he's not going to be able to beat it.
But wouldn't that happen regardless?
No. And I don't want to throw them to the other direction, which is give them guys that are just going to walk over. But I mean, if there's a way to give them finer gradients of matchmaking, do I think that in boxing that Saul Canelo Alvarez is the best guy in the world somewhere at 147 or 154 pounds? I do not. But I'm going to watch this guy fight. I really want to see what he can do at each next tiny little gradient. And I think if they want to keep a tournament, make it just a semifinal at the end of the season, right? Just 4 guys, and it's the one event after the next. But a quarterfinal where you got half a tournament on one night and the next half on the other week, it's just shipping product for the sake of shipping product.
You sure it's not just your aversion to the elbows on the ground?
Well, sometimes they bring in something that's very confusing. You seem like the kind of guy who likes a good old-fashioned tournament.
A tournament makes sense in the way in which when I was in China, we used to fight the Sanshou tournaments where you did each man. I don't think it works as well in MMA because the damage is much higher. So you end up with people getting hurt, trying to do it afterwards. I think the big problem I have with Bellator is simply name recognition. Like, I consider myself sort of a hardcore fan, but not an actual MMA journalist who has to follow this every day. I went through the list of 122 fighters. I recognized like 4 names.
Really?
Paul Daly, Brett Rogers, King Mo.
Guys who have made their name elsewhere.
Exactly.
They haven't built any stars themselves.
Exactly. And so I feel like Bellator's problem is it internally, once it has Spike, once it gets off of MTV2, which was like, when am I going to watch that? Gets on Spike, now it has a chance to start building its own. And I also think the other thing it needs to do seriously is get cut rate stars. Like, it needs to get the kind of stars that no longer work for UFC, but still have some name recognition, and not, as you said, stick them in a tournament, but stick them on a kind of undercard fight or marquee fight so that I know why I'm watching Bellator, and then I get to see the other people with it.
Seems like they've been kind of doing that a little bit more, just kind of picking up. They were very much opposed to just picking up whatever was left over by the UFC, but recently we've seen them kind of
seems like
taking more guys.
Yeah, they're trying to get a lot.
Since the Spike
ever
deal,
since the Spike deal happened, it seems like they're picking up a lot of guys. And I think, and more to your point, it's like you look. What are they at? Like 70 something now? Bellator?
74 is.
Can you say like Bellator 65? What happened there? Like, what was the Bellator that you like?
Zero signature.
Yeah, it all blends in together.
Exactly. One runs into the next, and they kind of want it that way, right? Like, one Friday is this quarterfinal, one Friday is the next featherweight final, and then one's the next heavyweight.
Why even number them?
Right. It becomes like the IFL, don't you think? Where the idea is that MMA is the star, not the fighter. That to me was the IFL model. Like, I just want to see MMA, and so I will go see this event, even though I know no one in it. right? And I think that's the Bellator's problem with the tournament structure. You put the sport ahead of the fighters, and what we found is that the fighters drive the sport.
One last point about Bellator. I want to be clear, I love their product. I watch it Friday all the time. If you look on MMAfighting.com, I do a ton of the coverage for Bellator, and I volunteer for it because I really like it.
Right.
Because I think the fighters are really good, and I like Sean Wheelock and Jimmy Smith and all that.
Agreed.
But they got to get out of casinos. The casinos were a great idea in the beginning because it insulated them from cost. Hey, you want to sell tickets? That's the casino's job. Advertising? That's the casino's job. We just got to show up. That was a genius stroke. But now it kind of insulates them from wider exposure. It's hard to get press when like your event is, you know, at the Harrah's down the street, you know, and it's you got blue hairs walking in to go ring the slots. It's not the same. You're not reaching the same kind of people. And so I feel like they can do the casinos a little bit. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying leave them entirely, but find a way to make a little more mainstream penetration, but where people go and see and where people live in these various cities they go to.
My final take on Bellator, and then we'll move on. I would like to see them get rid of the tournament as well. I would like to see them have rankings and make it into a big thing, sort of like the BCS. Like every Monday morning, Bellator will release their rankings, and based on that, you kind of know who's going where. Right. But they're just putting out fights. It's just fights now, but you'll know that they think Paul Daly is number 4, and he has to beat this guy who we're matching him up against next. Do something a little different, be different, but the tournament, I agree, is hurting them very much. Now, it's amazing. We've been talking for around 20 minutes. We haven't talked about the UFC. I know we talked about Zuffa, but there is a UFC event happening this week, and I don't want to go into predictions and things like that. That's not what we do, and maybe someone will even be watching this after, so I don't want it to be outdated. But what about the UFC in the UK? Because I consistently hear from fans that they are not happy. English fans, they're not happy with the way the UFC has been treating them. They're not happy with this card. They're not happy with the lack of shows. They're just not happy. This card, I think, has been a pretty good, is a pretty solid, 1 through whatever, 10 fights from the UFC with a mix of British fighters, interesting prospects, whatnot. Has the UFC treated the English fans unfairly here?
Well, I think they started off, it's just like they do in any market. They bring big fights originally, and they sort of scale it back the next on return visits. And they were there a lot. And the UK got fairly spoiled. It was UFC 75 when Quentin Rampage Jackson was fighting Dan Henderson. And you have that. And between that time and I think 2010, they were there 8 times. They were there a lot, usually pretty good cards, loaded with their own local talent at the bottom ends. And now, they've been there once over the last couple of years. And I think that there's just, it's the precedent. They want it to be like it was, like they were getting the title fights and all that. But the UFC is wanting to expand globally. They want to go other places. They can't, we're already accusing them of doing too many cards. They can't just keep going to the same place. I think part of it is they want, they want what they had, and they probably aren't going to get it. A lot of these markets that they go into, they don't return to for a couple, 3 years. So, at least they're still getting that one fight. But I agree with you 100% about this particular card. I think it's, for a fight fan, it's a good card from, the whole main card is looking really good. And there's some intrigue on the prelims as well. So I don't really see the complaints really on this one. But I think it's just that they want what they had.
It's a great card. It's a great card. Now, it's a fuel card, and I don't mean that to be disparaging. It's not, 2 title fights on a pay-per-view.
Right.
It's what it is. It's what it's supposed to be. And I think Dan Hardy fighting Amir Sadala in Nottingham, that's a great fight.
His hometown.
It's a great card. Okay, and I understand British fans' frustrations in the sense of what was to what is. There is a decline. The British market didn't reward the UFC the way the UFC expected. They had to scale it back. The British fans, if they had their way, they'd run the UFC into the ground.
Yeah.
I don't mean it to be insulting. That's the truth. Look, the UFC, when they began to expand internationally, they saw where WWE was big, or professional wrestling, and also where boxing was big. Buddy of mine just moved to London. He said you can't find a gym like a New York Sports or whatever it is, like a random gym for that has anything, and it costs £100 a month. But there are boxing gyms for £20 a month all over the place. And I think UFC thought if boxing can be big there, then we can train them to be MMA fans. And that has worked, and it hasn't worked, and it hasn't worked also in Latin America yet. They may get that way. But that was a crude model for expansion. And I think now they've kind of figured out there may be better ways to do it. The Brazil model, or the Brazil entry being a huge success. We'll see what happens in Asia. I just mean, for what the UFC gets in return out of the UK, I think this card is entirely appropriate. And the belly aching seems to me a little misplaced.
What do you think, Matt?
No, I'm totally with that. I think the problem with the UK is they don't have the same sort of enthusiasm that you see in Canada or even Brazil. And so I think the audience, Dana White, the UK was the first market he went into, overspent, And so I still think there's a little bit of burnt feelings from Zuffa that, look, this is as good as you're going to get. And so I think the UK wishes it was treated better. But, you know, as far as I'm concerned, Stefan Struve's a great fight.
Yeah.
Dan Hardy, Amir Sadallah is a great fight. You know, I would watch those on a pay-per-view event if it was the third fight on a pay-per-view event. So I don't see how, for a fuel event as well, why this is anything to complain about.
And also important to note, the card isn't even sold out. If they were that hungry for fights, show the UFC that you're hungry, buy the tickets.
And the other thing about the UFC still has to make money on pay-per-view. They took Joe Stevenson versus BJ Penn there with BJ Penn in his prime. I mean, that was probably the best BJ Penn ever. He goes in there and butchers, cuts him to fish bait, almost literally, and the event bombs on pay-per-view. Then he goes in, you know, you look at the other BJ fights in that same era, and they were all 500,000 to 700,000. You know, and that one I think did 280 or so. They can't get the same financial returns there. So it doesn't make sense to be overly invested there. It's just basic math, really.
And this is the new UFC. I was just looking at the UFC 154 card, which is a huge card for the UFC. The return of GSP. You've got GSP Condit, Catman Hendricks, and then the rest is a bunch of Canadians. You know, Francis Carmon. You've got the adopted Canadian. You've got, you know, just Ivan Menjivar, Mark Hominick. The days of seeing 5 incredible fights, you know, on the main card, especially with the Fox deal, are over. I want to finish on this point, and this kind of brings it back to the whole, you know, MMA Beat theme that we like to play up here. At the UFC 152 post-fight press conference, Dana White kind of went on this rant. He was a little upset going into the press conference. He was mad at the fans who were booing. He was mad at Demetrius Johnson, Joseph Benavidez. He was mad at the fans on Twitter who were unhappy with the fight. And then he went off on Steve Simmons of the Toronto Sun about this article that he wrote about the UFC, calling them the juggernauts. And he went off and kind of, you know, coincidentally enough, Steve Simmons' post-fight UFC 152 article was actually glowing and very positive. But Dana went off, and I was wondering, I was looking at the other UFC employees, and I want to get your take on this and the rest of the panels as well. Is that the brilliance of Dana White? If you're someone who works for the UFC, if you're someone who covers UFC, do you sit there and say, like, this guy is calling out, you know, journalists, fans, and whatnot because he's so passionate of the product, or is that just, you know, is that just a bad look? Like, you have a problem with one guy, should we all have to listen to that and see you run down all his points? Is that bad for the sport?
For years, you've been thinking that this will catch up to him. Just being that outspoken, that off the cuff, you know, that emotional, it will catch up to him at some point. But what starts to happen is you solidify Dana White even further into being Dana White. Well, it's Dana White, that's what he does. He knows for a fact that people just sort of forget his mistakes. Like, they'll move on very fast. We'll talk about him, but he can break some more news, and then we're talking about that. He knows that we can forget and move on as quickly as he wants it, you know? So he is brilliant in that way. I think he has a very good understanding of how to kind of generate perception and to obfuscate and all that stuff. I think he has a pretty good idea about when it comes to that stuff. And I also think he incorporates his own personality and people. That's the one part that a lot of the fans really like, is that he appears real to them. He says things off the cuff, and people are always going to think, you know, Dana White's our guy. He's one of us, and that's also part of his genius.
You have a problem with it?
I don't have a problem with it in the sense that I think it'll backfire or people will get mad at Dana White. I don't think that's the case, and I agree with Chuck. I mean, if anybody's good at generating perceptions, it's Dana White. I mean, the guy's brilliant at it. I just don't think it's going to work. You know, listen, it's easy, and you should, and Dana White did. When they were on the way up, he bragged about it. He put his finger in everyone's chest, whoever doubted him, and it said a negative word, and we all kind of high-fived when he did that, because it was, for us too, as fans and as journalists, it was kind of great. You're not going to change perceptions berating the press when you're having a bit of a cool-down period. And listen, MMA is having a bit of a cool-down period. It's not going to work. When your ticket sales are 6,800 in Toronto, that's okay, that's fine. John Jones, frankly, did him a favor by going to 152.
Right.
But attacking the press is not going to change that perception that some people think MMA is a little bit cooling off. It's not going to work. So he can go and say, this reporter from this publication, also he's overly sensitive about print. Print's on the way down, everybody. But the other part is, not for this guy. But I just mean, do you really think that fans are going to, over time, change their perception? They're voting with their feet. They're voting with their dollars. You know, these Strikeforce cards, as we mentioned before, 1,500 sold. 1,500? I mean, it's nothing. So here's my point. Yes, he can do all that, and if the guy changes tune, great. Over time, is that going to really change the reality about the health of MMA, it will not.
Matt?
My only regret is that I have never written anything that he picked out and jumped on top of. Because
keep trying.
I mean, the thing, and I was thinking about this with Bellator. It's a coming of age. It's a coming out party when Dana pulls you aside and says you're a dirty scumbag. I mean, the amazing thing about him is he's the fire starter, and you haven't arrived until you have done something that annoys him, and that is his charm. He is like the ultimate fanboy, that aspect of him, in the sense that when something bothers him, he's like the guy at the bar yelling at the screen. And for years, I thought the same thing. Like, it would catch up with him. Like, you know, when the sport matures, you would want a more kind of CEO type, like the NFL or MLB, but I just think the sport of MMA is perfect for his personality.
You've annoyed him plenty over the years, and he still lets you put the mic in his face.
That is
So.
true.
He called you a name on Twitter the other day.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. My take on it, as someone who has interviewed him a bunch of times, does he do the right thing? Does he say the right thing all the time? No. He makes our job a whole lot more interesting as opposed to, you know, covering a normal sports owner or executive. I don't. For the particular example of him calling out Steve Simmons of the Toronto Sun, I thought he was taking away from a pretty good event.
Yeah.
You had an issue with that guy, just call out that guy.
Yeah.
He wasn't even there.
Also,
he wasn't even there.
Did you feel the article was overly harsh?
No,
I thought it was fairly not that big a deal.
It had a negative undertone, and it was a little
Snarky.
It was a little snarky.
Yeah, sure,
I didn't love the article. I didn't love it.
But isn't that tabloid press?
Yes, and that's what the Toronto Sun is.
Yeah.
I can understand why it pissed him off. I just didn't think that was the best place to do it because none of us wrote it. So why do we have to hear it? But that's kind of what makes him interesting. We were all sitting there eating it up, listening to it at least. So
Sitting here talking about it right
and we're
now.
saying,
The only thing that concerns me is when people get banned from events.
Right.
Like when there's an actual impact on a journalist who loves the sport's life. That to me is a step too far. When people get discredited, can't get a job, or he calls up editors and says, "Don't hire this person." That to me is a step too far. But if the back and forth, you write an article that annoys him and he comes out and says, "You're annoying," that to me is just kind of the back and forth, and I think he overdid it, but it was fun.
all right, we'll leave it at that. Matthew Pauly, the author of Tapped Out. You can pick it up at bookstores on October 2nd, paperback. There's also a hardcover version, but that's gone. It's been sold out.
Oh,
no
sold
one can
out.
get that. Right?
No. But if you go to Amazon, you can still buy pre-order today.
Give us the pitch. Tapped Out. It's a fantastic concept. What exactly happened?
It was
here?
a kind of George Plimpton-esque. I spent 2 years studying with some of the top trainers across the country, Henzo in Vegas. I studied Extreme Couture to see what it would be like for an average, slightly overweight, middle-aged guy to try to become an MMA fighter. So at the end, I have my MMA fight. And unlike Rampage Jackson, I won my last one.
Why would you spoil the ending for us?
It's on YouTube, right?
It's on
but I'm
YouTube,
just
but the journey is the story.
Right, that is true. And
journey is the
also,
story.
he is the author of American Shaolin, which is another great book, and he blogs at fightlinker.com.
With the great Ryan Harkness.
That is true. So thank you so much for stopping by. Good luck with the book, and good luck with your next project, which is about
a biography of Bruce Lee.
Look at this guy.
So,
What have you written, Luke?
I've been on my honeymoon. I've written nothing.
He's dwarfing us over there, man.
Good job, as always, Luke, and you can catch him, Spike TV's MMA Uncensored, and of course, Mr. Chuck Mindenhall, the man with the famous hat, who you can also catch on ESPN's MMA Live, which airs Friday. When does that air, by the way? Friday mornings, Thursday nights? I can never get it right. Thursdays-ish. Okay.
Fridays, East Coast morning, usually.
Great stuff, as always. You can catch him as well, ESPN.com and ESPN the magazine. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching the 3rd episode of the MMA Beat. For Chuck, Luke, Matthew, I'm Ariel Helwani. Thank you so much for watching.